Hello and welcome to this video on the Joranalogue Contour 1. This is a function generator module that can do a ton of things. It's a real backbone of a modular system. But let's check out what's to come in the video before we get into it. Now I'll overlay an image of the Contour 1 and run you down the features. It's a slew limiter, which we can think of like a filter for sub-audio tones, but as it will run at audio rates, it's also a low-pass filter. It can be an oscillator, an LFO, an envelope follower. We can hold it like a track and hold, kind of like sample and hold, but it lets signal pass rather than always holding. It's an inverter, it's a PWM beastly stereo synth tone generator. It's a whole range of things. Now running down the panel, we have a button to trigger the module. We also have gate and trigger inputs. Gate will have sustain periods in there. Trigger is just triggered behavior. We have our input, rise and fall times, bend controls to bend the rising and falling voltages through exponential, logarithmic and linear like curves. We've got CV for those rates for rise and fall, CV for the bends, the hold, the output, the inverted output, and the rise and fall gates, which give us gates when the rise stage is active and the fall stage is active. There's a whole load of things this can do. As I said, it's a real backbone of a modular system. The timing index is on screen, so do skip around. But most importantly to me, obviously check out Contour 1, but do watch the video and learn about function generators, slew limiters, and the kind of real building blocks of modular. And I hope you can apply these ideas and patches to Contour 1 and of course other modules that you may already have in your system. So let's dive into some patches. So here we'll look at Contour 1 as an envelope generator. Now I have the button on the top of the module to trigger this behavior. And we'll quickly explore the shapes and the curvature that we can get. Even rise and fall times would give us a triangle-like wave. Think of this as the attack and the release, or the attack and the decay. And it's nicely wide-ranging in its control. Now the curvature control, the bend, will go from linear. And this blends smoothly across to exponential behavior. Nice kind of tight whip and suck up to that peak voltage. And then we can blend across to logarithmic behavior. Same for the falling stage. Exponential, and it'll go super tight. Linear falls. Or logarithmic falls. Now there's two ways we can use Contour 1 as an envelope generator in a patch. We could use it with a gate or a trigger, or rather the gate or trigger input. It's irrelevant what you put into the trigger input. It will always just trigger the rise and the fall, the shape that we have set. If this goes into the gate, it will be sustain dependent. This will sustain at peak voltage once the rise has let it get to that, as long as it's high on that gate input. So there's our gate signal, adding attack to that, or a rise to that, and a release, or a fall. Again into the trigger in, this is just triggered. Now one of the nice things here is we can mix gated and triggered behaviour using different sources. If I take, say, an in-time sine LFO, which if I was to plug this into the input, you can hear that's what it is. I can use that in the gate. I can still use my clock to trigger it, to get more complex behaviours. Just clocking that trigger input there, I could also take this sine wave LFO into the actual input, and this is going to add this voltage to what Contour 1 is creating and set a base level for these envelopes to work on. Again, giving more complex behaviours. The fact these are in time is giving us some nice rhythms. We also get gates for the rise and fall stage. This will be active while either the rise or the fall stage is active. So with a longer shape, the blue trace there is showing us the gate output during the rise stage. Going to fall, the gate is active as long as that falling stage is. So here we're going to look at the Contour 1 as a slew generator, and one that we can freeze and hold the output of. I have some sample and hold information at the input, just stepped random CV. This is controlling on the main output my filter cutoff, which has a saw wave at its input, and the inverted out is doing some tonal modulation of the core oscillator. You can hear the signal here is just pretty much passing through. I'm set to slew, and I'm set to the full range. Now we can add equal slew, as you would get on just a normal slew generator with a single knob, a single slew amount, by turning both rise and fall up evenly. With their times even and their shapes even as well, in terms of having the same settings, it's very much an even slew across the rise and fall. Now I could curve that fall, giving us a different kind of lopsided slew. We could just slew the rise and have a nice log curve. Just the fall. And by applying a voltage to the hold input, which I'm just going to turn up on offset voltage here, we can freeze the behaviour of the whole module. We can do that without any slew. And I like doing this with random gates, freezing my modulation to randomly interrupt random modulation. So turning Contour 1 into an LFO is super simple. Have an output patched into data so you can see the waveform, into a multiple, link to from Joranalogue, nice little buffered multiple, out into all sorts in the system, FM depths, some distortion modulation, some stereo filtering, and kind of all sorts going on, as you'll hear. So turning my sound on, this is a patch in stereo. Simply flick this onto loop. I'm in the full range mode as opposed to audio. And there's our LFO. Now with bend set center on both sides, it's going to be a linear shape, and with even times we'll get a triangle-like wave. Drop in the rise, get a falling saw, and a ramp if we have rise time but really fast fall time. Now the bend is going to change this exponential linear log shape. We get a nice tight whip upwards if we make that exponential. Or a log-like shape, which is quite common for a lot of ADSR type modules. And then that falling stage. Nice tight exponential shape. Through to a logarithmic drop. Now of course we can modulate the rate of both, one or the other, of the rise and the fall, and we can modulate the bends independently as well. But what I'd like to do here is check out the gate, trigger and hold, and the input too. So let's put a gate into the input. I'm just going to turn this on. Adds this voltage to the LFO. My voltage is set up kind of bass level for this to oscillate and loop an LFO on top of. Now into gate, when this is looping, either as audio or as CV, the gate will set this being active or not. There's no signal present. We can see that on this LED cable, it's not active. When I flick it in, it's active. Maybe make a faster. So it's resetting and making that active or not. Into the trigger, this will just re-trigger and reset the behaviour. It doesn't determine whether the looping is actually on or off. So having seen Contour 1 as an LFO, looping envelope, looping function generator, low frequency oscillator, here's some more complex LFO behaviour. Now I've got different modulation signals into both rate controls and both bend controls. You can see those LEDs changing and the rates of the rise and fall change. This is set to loop and in the full range mode. I'm also triggering this to get little triggered spikes into this function generator, and I've got an intermittent signal coming into the hold to periodically freeze and hold this signal. So here Contour 1 is working as an envelope follower, and it's a super simple patch. Let's kind of cancel this out. Lose the bass, and here's a drum break coming into the modular. It's coming into this multiple, one into Contour and one into the mixer. Now here's my bass sound, simple square wave through this filter, low resonance, low pass filter. Now bringing the attack right down, we can use the fall time as the decay for the envelope. And again, this is the drum break into Contour 1 and the output into the data scope, and then out to modulate the filter's cutoff. So getting rid of all this kind of excessive information with a longer fall time. We can hear rhythmically it's following that drum break. Bringing that back in. Playing around with the bend, the curve. Bit of res on the filter. And of course, with everything under voltage control, we could play around with the decay of the envelope. We could also use the rise time to kind of get rid of some of the transient information. I'll lose the drums and we'll look at the rise time. Kind of just softens the edge of this envelope following. We could invert this behaviour. Simply coming out of the inverted out, we can see that's flipped down. So I'm going to open up my cutoff and have this pull it back down again. With the drums back in. We could use those rise and fall gates to derive a gate from this signal as well. So here I'm using the fall output to trigger an envelope and the envelope to move the filter. So we can derive in-time gates from our source and envelope follower source really simply. So here we're going to use the Contour 1 as a filter, low pass filter. Now a slew limiter rounds off hard edges in sub-audio frequencies. If you think of that up at audio rates, say an audio rate square wave, which is what we have here, green trace on data there is the input to Contour 1, rounding off those edges is exactly what a low pass filter would do. So by slewing that at audio rates, we create a basic low pass filter. So by bringing those times up, in audio mode, set to slew, not to loop. Although there is some interesting looping behaviour with audio at the input that we'll look at in this video as well. we can simply slew both sides and get low pass filter like behaviour. Now of course we could do different rise and fall times, play around with the bend, the shape of the rise and fall. And you could see there on the blue trace on data, which is the output of Contour 1, all those different kind of wave shapes we can get. Now simply plugging in an LFO to the first rate control, which normals across to the next. There's a typical kind of enveloped low pass like behaviour. A few more tricks though, and this is really why I like Contour 1 as an audio processor. Just muting that output, the main output, the rise and fall gate outputs that are active when the rise stage or the fall stage is active are going into my mixer panned hard left and right. So make sure you're listening in stereo. And it gives us a great kind of PWMing stereo image. Without modulation, I'm going to get a pitch sequence into my oscillator that's providing the square wave. Main output. Nice big sound. Nice buzzy stereo image when they're all playing together. Now a couple of additional little tricks that we can do is to patch another oscillator, and this is tracking this pitch sequence into various inputs, ultimately to kind of see what happens, but we get sync-like effects and some nice audio rate alias downsample-like tones too. So here's an oscillator into the hold. I play around with the tuning of this. We could try gate it. Playing around with this modulation oscillator again. Some really nice overtones. So let's explore Contour 1 as an oscillator with some simple arpeggios. I play around with the rate and some of the actual arpeggio chord tones that come in, as well as the wave shape. So because bending the rising and falling portion of these waves gives us this pitch change, I wanted to exploit that for a nice pitch dependent vibrato. Now this is pitch dependent because I have a volt per octave signal coming into the rate, which as the graphic shows goes to both the rate of the rise and fall, but I'm also splitting that up into the rate of my LFO. Now turning up the depth of modulation on my LFO, you can hear that bending this wave gives us changing harmonics and also this drift in pitch. Now compared to other analog designs, this pitch drift is really heavily minimized and kind of tightened up, but the fact it's there means you get this lovely vibrato. I'm just reducing the depth of modulation. You just get a really lovely tone. Of course, without it, it's just static. I'm going to bend the fall up to a linear position. Really nice soft tone there. Now going through a VCA, added some effects. It just gives a really rich tone. So here's a patch from the manual, and as with other Joranalogue modules, the manual's great, well worth a read. And this is the improved saw wave oscillator patch. Now, simply setting rise time or fall time to maximum, and the other one to a lower setting, audio, flick it into loop. There's our saw wave. Now you can hear it seems slightly filtered. The upper harmonics that you might expect, that brighter saw wave sound, just isn't quite present. And and simply patching in the fall output into the trigger, so a little bit of feedback patching, will speed up that transition into that falling stage, giving us a much brighter sound. Hope that's really obvious on the video, certainly is in my headphones. So here's a rather noisy little beat with a lazy laid-back snare, kick, hi-hat and some background noise. Now I'm coming in, you're not missing much by me zooming in here, simply to the trigger input and then the falling gate output, which is the blue trace, input is the green trace, is feeding the sampler, the delayed trigger or the delayed gate. Now bringing the attack time right down, this is triggering in time, and when it goes from the attack, which is near instantaneous, to the fall stage, it's just firing right on time. You can hear it's right on top of that hi-hat, right there on the grid. Delaying the rise time delays the onset of the falling stage, and therefore the gate output we get on the falling stage. So as I bring the rise up, that's kind of way too kind of drunken sloppy feeling, but all these in-between settings, you can hear the hi-hat hits first. So using gate delays to shift rhythms around gives us nice push and pull custom kind of grooves. So the hi-hat is now going through this module. Input again green trace, output blue trace. As I bring up that rise, it delays that falling stage, and this gate delay is going to push that hi-hat off the grid. Again, give us another variation of this kind of lazy, wonky beat. So here we're looking at getting more dynamic envelopes by merging two different gate rhythms, different gate sources, into the input of Contour 1. Now I'm using a mixer off screen to feed the input, and the green trace there on the oscilloscope is my actual input. Turning down one of the gates, here's a quarter note gate, and this is simply working like an envelope generator, or more specifically like a slew generator. We can slew the onset of voltage, adjust that rise curve, and then this is like an added release stage, a fall or a slew off the back of that gate going low. Now instead of going into the input, where the input level is actually going to change things on the module, it's going to adjust the peak of the output, the peak of this envelope. We could gate that for a 10 volt output. Regardless of input level, it will just go below the threshold for the gate input and not be active. Sticking with our input, because it's voltage dependent, it's level dependent, I could mix my random gate at say a lower level, and then add in my quarter note gate at a higher level, so we've got a dynamic pattern. Now I could actually swap the random gate, this one, for a random CV, and then this is simply slewing that CV, but mixing that with the gate again, we can think of a way as giving us dynamic envelopes. And because it can be slew, because it can be an envelope, because it can be a gated envelope or triggered envelope, play around with these behaviours. Going back to a random gate, I'm actually going to plug that straight into the trigger. My input is still going to be the quarter note gate, so again, another way of merging this idea of a slew generator and an envelope to create something more dynamic and expressive. So here we've got a kick drum from Contour. Now this is going through a VCA, but if I remove the VCA, here's the output of Contour, and I'll remove the other drum sounds. So this is entirely Contour on its own. Have an envelope coming into the rate, I could take that out. This is tuned low, it's in the full mode, it's looping, and it's gated behaviour that's turning the sound on and off. So it's sub-audio being pushed up into the audio range with an envelope that I'm going to scale on select 2, change the depth of that envelope modulation for the pitch mod, and that's our kick. That gives us kind of a nice thick, flabby, fuzzy kick because it's tuned, as I said, sub-audio once that envelope drops back down to the bass pitch. Now by using another envelope and a VCA, we can tidy up that tail and add a bit more of a dynamic shape rather than just gating this on and off. Add in some extra percussion. And there's a little kick out of contour. So after just making a kick, I kind of thought, I wonder what other percussion we can get. So just experimenting, feeding outputs back into inputs, injecting noise and audio rate modulation. So there's a kick and a hi-hat in the background, and here it is as a kind of weird snare clap, just to encourage you to play around with making more kind of experimental noises. And of course, whether you're into that or not, you can shape that tightly and snappily through a VCA with an envelope and create your own percussion sounds. In this instance, the attack time kind of filters out the influence of the noise in the patch. So let's check it out in isolation. I'll take off the bit of reverb that's on there as well. So kind of resonant, harsh noise, down to just a fuzzy tone. And of course, just experiment, play around, and see what weird feedback, noise, audio rate, modulated bits of percussion you can create. And there's one final percussion patch as we're playing around, kind of experimenting with this thing. Here's just some more random, weird percussion. Now there's a kick and snare in the background. Just kind of setting the tone of the thing. Here's noise into the contour 1, and then random modulation into both rate and both bend controls. This then goes through a VCA, nice snappy envelope, random triggers to that envelope. So random modulation, noise at the input, a little bit of reverb in the background, more weird random percussion. So here we're going to explore audio rate, sample and hold style modulation with the hold input. My input is a triangle wave that's going through a VCA with an envelope opening the VCA, which is being modulated. If I pull that out, basic random arpeggio with the LFO modulating my decay time. Now plugging in an audio rate source into the hold. When the signal is high coming in on this audio source, it does hold the voltage, but when it isn't, it passes the voltage through. Sweeping this audio rate source. Nice alias-like overtones. Are much more destructive at lower rates. Now anything that's kind of pleasant in some ways, but a bit off in others, it's often rectified by getting that to track. So let me plug my Volt Proctive source into the oscillator and the hold, and we get more pitch tracked normal-like behaviour in terms of it being a wave shaping like effect. So here we've created this wide, rich, PWMing, sync-like overtone stereo sound from just a simple square wave at the input. Now I'll remove my modulation. And this is just a basic square wave with a volt per octave sequence. Using the rise and fall gate outputs in stereo, I can adjust the rise and fall times and the bend shape controls to get some nice stereo PWM-like effects. And it's nicely interactive because as the rise time changes, that stage is active that bit longer. That's going to push on and affect the falling stage. So these kind of gate outputs that we're using at audio rate as a kind of stereo oscillator, they all change and interact really nicely. Now adding an LFO to the bend control of the rise. Another LFO to the bend of the fall. We can hear these two sides pulse width modulating at different rates. Now here's another square wave oscillator tuned a bit higher, following that same volt-per octave sequence into the hold, giving us these kind of sync-like overtones as we audio rate hold this signal. Without the modulation, there's the hold. So here the Contour 1 is a subharmonic generator. Think of it as a divider that works its way down from this input signal down through the subharmonic series. Now the upper sound is my input. This is just a triangle wave. We can see that on data. And this one is Contour 1's output. We can get some quite funky wave shapes and nice subharmonic locked intervals. Now, I'll just play around with Contour 1 and show you some of this different harmonic locking. We can use the rise time to lock to different subharmonics and the fall time as a sort of tone control. Now turning down these VCAs and removing their modulation, I'll walk you through the patch, and there's a little bit to go through. We need some kind of gated switch, and of course Select 2, video in the description, is perfect for that. So my input goes into Select 2, the output goes to trigger the Contour 1, this is non-looping and it's in the audio range. I'm then using the rise output to the select input on Select 2. So during the rising stage, it's going to ignore the input which is feeding the trigger. And that's why we get this subharmonic locking. The main output is what we're listening to. So bringing the sound back in, let's listen to these different locked intervals and shaping, just droning straight out of Contour 1. The fall time there is that kind of tonal behaviour. You can see on the scope, you get richer tones when it's up full. But having this come down can act like a sort of tone control. Modulation back to both these VCAs. Let's try adding a bit of modulation. So there's just an in-time gate signal shifting my intervals. And by controlling the depth of modulation, I'll be able to scale how far this gate signal is pushing this tuning difference on the rise time. So here's a really great patch from the manual that Joranalogue call a combined AM and FM patch. I have Contour 1 looping, currently nothing into the input or this modulation, volt per octave into the rate control, which normals across to the rate control for the fall time as well. Simple oscillator, and it is going through some delay. I'm going to leave that on because it's just a nice little ambient trail in the background. Super simple, the output is playing against another oscillator just for some eye candy on data there if you're curious. Contour 1 goes through a VCA with an envelope, super simple, little high-pitched melodic line. Now by adding an input, the now oscillating Contour 1 is going to ride this input voltage while still looping with its volt per octave controlled oscillator action that's going on. So my input here is a triangle wave from another oscillator that's also tracking the same volt per octave sequence, and I'm going to turn up my attenuator that is letting that signal into the input. And you can hear we're starting to get FM, AM synthesis like tones, right through to nice harmonious FM type tones. I'll change the tuning of the oscillator that's coming into the input. Turning that signal down. And back up again. This combined AM FM through the input works really well. So thanks for checking out this video of Contour 1. Holding it here is kind of nicer than my fugly mug. Support me on Patreon if you like the work that I do. Huge thanks to Joranalogue for sponsoring this video. Hit like, comment, subscribe, all the usual stuff. I'll see you next time. Cheers.